Fear by Gabriela Mistral. I don't want them to turn my little girl into a swallow. She would fly far away into the sky and never fly again to my straw bed. Or she would nest in the eaves where I could not comb her hair. I don't want them to turn my little girl into a swallow. I don't want them to make my little girl a princess in tiny golden slippers. How could she play on the meadow? And when night came, no longer would she sleep at my side. I don't want them to make my little girl a princess. And even less do I want them one day to make her queen. They would put her on a throne where I could not go to see her. And when night time came, I could never rock her. I don't want them to make my little girl a queen. Fear by Gabriela Mistral. Gabriela Mistral was the pen name of Lucilla Godoy Alcaega. Mistral grew up in poverty and experienced several tragedies in her early life, including the death of her father and the suicide of her younger sister. Despite these hardships, Mistral excelled academically and began her teaching career at the age of 15. She began writing poetry in her teens and published her first book of poems, Desolation, in 1922. The book earned her national recognition in Chile and marked the beginning of her career as a poet. In 1945, Mistral became the first Latin American woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature in recognition of her contributions to the field of poetry. Mistral was also a diplomat and served as a representative of the Chilean government in various countries, including the United States and Mexico. She died in 1957 at the age of 67. Mistral's poetry often deals with themes of love and loss, exploring the emotions and experience of romantic love, maternal love, and grief. She was deeply interested in motherhood and explored this theme in many of her poems, often reflecting on the joys and challenges of raising children. Mistral frequently used images and metaphors from the natural world in her poetry, drawing on the beauty and power of the natural environment to explore human emotions and experiences. She was a committed activist and humanitarian who wrote extensively about social justice issues, including poverty, inequality, and the struggles of marginalized communities. She was a feminist who advocated for women's rights throughout her life. Mistral was deeply spiritual and often drew on religious imagery and symbolism in her poetry, exploring themes of faith, redemption, and transcendence. She was proud of her Chilean heritage and often explored themes of national and cultural identity in her poetry, celebrating the richness and diversity of Latin American culture. These are some of her poems that deal with themes of life, love, and death. She originally wrote in Spanish, and if you are interested in reading the English translations of these poems, please go to this website, literaryladiesguide.com, and read these poems. Fear by Gabriela Mistral. I don't want them to turn my little girl into a swallow. She would fly far away into the sky and never fly again to my straw bed. or she would nest in the eaves where I could not comb her hair. I don't want them to turn my little girl into a swallow. I don't want them to make my little girl a princess in tiny golden slippers. How could she play on the meadow? And when night came, no longer would she sleep at my side. I don't want them to make my little girl a princess. And even less do I want them one day to make her queen. They would put her on a throne where I could not go to see her. And when night time came, I could never rock her. I don't want them to make my little girl a queen. Let's try to understand the poem Fear. In this poem, a mother expresses her fear or anxiety of losing her child, who she refers to as my little girl. In the first line, I don't want them to turn, them can be taken as society or outside forces. The phrase my little girl in the second line suggests the maternal love and concern for her daughter. It also implies a very close, deep relationship between the speaker and her child. It highlights the speaker's desire to protect and care for her. It also emphasizes the vulnerability of the child and the fear of losing her. In the second line, swallow can be taken both as a symbol and metaphor. The swallow is a migratory bird and it flies into great distances. The image of turning the child into a swallow suggests that the child would be transformed into a very strong, independent person who would go into faraway lands beyond the reach of the speaker. The swallow is also symbolic of change and transition. It is quite clear that the mother fears that once the daughter is grown up, she would be physically detached from her and she would never be able to take care of her. In the fourth line, my straw bed is symbolic of a humble home and simple way of living. The speaker also fears that her child might choose to nest in the eaves, which would keep her out of reach and out of sight. The imagery of combing her hair is symbolic of the speaker's desire to care for and protect her child. In the last two lines, she repeats the first two lines, emphasizing her anxiety over the future of her daughter and mother-daughter relationship. The repetition of the word swallow also represents the speaker's fear of the unknown and the uncertainties. The second stanza also begins with the phrase, I don't want. The repetition of this phrase, I don't want, emphasizes the speaker's fear and anxiety. The second line refers to the speaker's fear of society's expectations and pressure. The young girls are expected to conform to gender norms. Princess can be taken both as a symbol and metaphor in the poem. The speaker is not referring to a literal princess here. It is symbolic of social expectations and pressures that come with gendered roles. The mother fears that the gendered stereotype imposed on her girl may limit her opportunity and freedom. In the third line, the image of the tiny golden slippers represents the idea of her daughter being forced to wear uncomfortable, restrictive, or even fancy clothing. The mother thinks that these are impractical for playing and exploring the meadow. How could she play on the meadow is a rhetorical question. The meadow represents a space where a child can run, jump, and play freely without the restrictions of societal expectations or gendered roles. And when night time came, no longer would she sleep at my side. This suggests a fear of separation between the speaker and her daughter. She thinks that her daughter will grow up too quickly and become too independent to the point where she will no longer need to sleep by her side. The repetition of the first two lines, I don't want them to make my little girl a princess, highlights the mother's objection towards turning her daughter into a rigid gender stereotype. In the third stanza, the mother expresses her fear that her daughter will be forced into a position of power and authority. She fears that she will be isolated from her family and loved ones. The metaphor throat suggests the great power that comes with the higher position in the society. The speaker values the close bond she has with her daughter more than any social status or position of authority her daughter may achieve. And when night time came, I could never rock her expresses her fear of being unable to comfort her daughter as she grows older and becomes more independent. The act of rocking a child to sleep is often associated with nurturing and comforting role of a mother. These lines also convey a sense of sadness and loss that comes with the realization that children grow up quickly and that the time we have with them as parents is limited. Overall, the poem Fear expresses a universal sentiment of the love, fear, and anxiety that comes with the joys and challenges of parenting. What are the themes discussed in this poem? The very first one is fear of separation and loss. The poem expresses the speaker's fear of losing her daughter to societal pressures and expectations, as well as the fear of losing the close bond between mother and child as the child grows older and becomes more independent. Another theme is gender roles and expectations. The poem critiques social expectations and gender roles that limit a child's freedom to play and explore, and the pressure to conform to rigid gender expectations. Another theme discussed here is motherhood and role of a mother. The act of rocking a child to sleep is often associated with the nurturing and comforting role of a mother. The poem explores the complex emotions and fears that come with being a parent, particularly when it comes to balancing the desire to protect our children with the need to let them grow and explore the world on their own. Another theme discussed in the poem is the passage of time and the transience of life. The poem highlights the sadness and loss that comes with the realization that children grow up quickly and that the time we have with them as parents is limited. The writer has employed many literary devices in the poem to bring out its themes and message. Imagery is an important technique used throughout the poem. The images of a swallow, princess, and queen are used to highlight the mother's anxiety and fear. The poem also creates imagery of a caring mother who combs the hair of her daughter and also who rocks her child into sleep. What are the symbols used here? The swallow, princess, and queen are the symbols to represent the gender stereotypes in the society. Strawberry symbolizes humble lifestyle, and meadow is symbolic of a carefree lifestyle of a child who is close to nature. What are the metaphors used in the poem? Turn the little girl into a swallow, turning little girl into a princess, and finally turning the little girl into a queen. All these are metaphors used in the poem. Then what about repetition? The writer has repeated some of the lines throughout the poem. I have highlighted the repeated lines in green color. Rhetorical questions is another technique employed by the writer. How could she play on the meadow is a rhetorical question. She has used this to emphasize the mother's fear and anxiety over the future of her daughter. The first person narrative is used in the poem. I is the speaker here, and it clearly projects the fears and concerns of a mother. The writer maintains a melancholic tone throughout the poem, as the speaker here is expressive of her fear and anxiety of losing her daughter. The language used in the poem is simple, and the writer has used unrhymed verses throughout the poem. She has also used enjambment or run-on lines throughout the poem. What are the examples for enjambment? She would fly far away into the sky and never fly again. This line continues up to the next one. And also the next line, she would nest in the eaves where I could not comb her hair. And then in this stanza also, and when night came, no longer would she sleep at my side, is an example for enjambment. So throughout the poem, the writer has used run-on lines. So these are the techniques employed by the writer in the poem Fear. And that brings us to the end of today's session on Booktopia Lessons. I hope you found it informative and educational. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you in the next lesson.